who has access to what? If you are looking for identity and access management talk, you have come to the right place. This is the Identity at the Center podcast. Hosts Jeff Stedman and Jim McDonald are strategic advisors with Identity's advisory services practice and are here to talk about a wide range of identity and access management topics. Comments, questions, and accolades can all be sent to identityatthecenter.com. And now, on to the show.
So today we've got a special guest, Luis Almeida. He's VP of Business Development here at Identity, and we thought it would be interesting to have him on to talk a little bit about how the value proposition of identity management has changed. And I know that this is something that's been near and dear to his heart for a while. And we've also got Jim McDonald here too. Guys, you want to say hello?
Hey guys, Jim McDonald here. I'm really excited about having Luis on. Luis has been a veteran in our industry for many, many years. I'm not going to steal his thunder by doing his introduction, but you know, he's worked at several identity and access management focused companies in the past. And so he has a really good, unique perspective on the industry, and he's really good at telling stories. So Luis, why don't you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jeff. So for me, it's a pleasure to be here because the respect I have for the real practitioners in this space, right? And especially Jim and Jeff, who have done it. They've been on the other side of the table, really managing programs and doing the hard work. So these are people that I have a great deal of respect for. I think the really good salespeople are the ones that try not to speak, try to give the customers a lot of space and listen. So this is a little bit uncomfortable for me, but I'll do my best, and I really appreciate the kind introduction, guys.
Yeah, no, I think this is a model opening for all of our guests. If they can show the appropriate amount of deference to Jim and I, everything's just going to go great.
Yeah, and I really mean it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah,
but
no.
As Jim was saying, I've been in the space really 15 years, over 15 years. I got my start at CA back when it was Computer Associates. I was a storage guy. Really selling backups that, you could do the backup, but then you couldn't restore, which was really a horrible business to be in. And a good friend of mine, Mark Potter, who ran identity for the Southeast for CA at that time, he heard me on the phone banging away, trying to help customers. And he said, I want you to come join the security team. And I looked at him and said, I think you're crazy. There's absolutely no way. I know nothing about security. And I picked up the phone and kept dialing. And he insisted, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. And so I was there for 8 years. I was very successful selling SiteMinder and CA Identity Manager. And, we used to say we'd sell out of a hole because people weren't always pleased with their experience with CA. So we really had to work hard there. And after 8 years, Mark left CA and went to join the team at Quest Software. He started the identity and access management team, and I was his first hire at Quest. And that was kind of a risk for me because Quest had just acquired Volker Informatica, a German identity and access management company. We knew Quest as a tools company, AD management, and we went over there and we actually did relatively well. I was there for 3 years, and then we suffered through a process where Vinnie Smith was going to take Quest private. And then Michael Dell said, no, you're not. We're coming in and buying you. Michael Dell's engine spoke louder, and we ended up going to work for Dell. And at Dell, large sales organization, I felt identity was going to get lost in the shuffle. Identity being such a specific thing to sell in position that I left Dell and was fortunate enough to come join our team here at Identity. I've been here 5 years. It's just been, for me, just a tremendous experience. And the reason for that is I think in the identity space, consulting services is so important. And the ability for us to listen to the requirements a customer has, and to be able to position value beyond products, right? And looking at programs and the stuff the advisory team does is just easier. It's more flexible. We can be of more service. So that's it. That's my background, and here we are.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Luis. You're there kind of in the early days of identity management, and the approach has changed so much over time, and the vendor landscape has changed over time. I think that's been driven a lot by the value proposition for customers. And what I was hoping you could maybe talk about was kind of walk us through that history. So where were customers getting value of, and what was driving their investment, say 10 to 15 years ago, and how's it changed over time?
Sure. So, I'm somewhat a big fan of the Gartner product hype cycle, right? So that's the curve that, the product increases in hype over time, and then it, dips down into a trough of disillusionment, starts to slowly go back up, and then goes into the plateau of productivity. So I would say that I missed the upturn towards the peak. I really joined the identity space really at the peak of the hype, right? That's when CA acquired Integrity, all these other acquisitions were going on, and identity, there really weren't identity practitioners, really. I mean, but people really had high hopes for identity. And at that time, what we were telling customers is, and we believe this, and I think it's really important to say, the people that I know that do well in sales and in service providing and helping others, they come from a place of sincerity, right? The place is one of helping, and you get paid and you're going to make money, but if your heart has to be in the mode of helping. So I would go out to my customers when I first got hired and try to help them. And what everybody expected that we were going to help them with was something called automagic provisioning. Okay. We were going to give everybody access to the systems they needed programmatically with the right permissions and entitlements across thousands of applications. And it was really an IT optimization value proposition. And it was something we were sure we were going to be able to do. We were all setting out to do it. And, that really, it was a value around making people's jobs easier. And of course, enhancing security because you're somewhat facilitating least privilege.
And Luis, if I could jump in for a second, these are the early days of Active Directory, right? So you're going back around 03, 04 timeframe. I think Active Directory really started with Windows 2000. So it took some time to get established. And within the enterprise walls, it wasn't like, people stood up Active Directory and they integrated 200 applications into it. So if you automated Active Directory, you're good to go on a large part of your IT landscape. This was the days where applications, for the most part, each had their own username and password. Those usernames could vary, things like that. So from my recollection and kind of being in that space and being a practitioner, it was about, wow, we've got this Wild West of access is being managed in different ways across different applications. And there was not a central identity store for the most part.
Yeah, I do remember it that way. And the way I remember it really, to me, which is really symbolic of that time, were all the role engineering exercises, right? People would get locked in a conference room for years, and Ernst & Young or Accenture or whoever would come in and just do these huge role engineering exercises to create these buckets of permissions that then we would use to provision. I was very fortunate back then that I met a good friend of mine. He's still a great friend of mine, him and Vimadalal, who's the CEO of Simeo today. And, I linked up with him. And, remember, I was a storage guy. I didn't really know what I was talking about. So I'd let him do all the talking. And we always led with this concept of role engineering, right? You need to know what you're going to provision. And that's what we led with. And I think, Jim, we weren't looking at groups, right? We were really looking at what were those entitlements, permissions inside of the application. And it was very large services projects in a large enterprise, and they were very challenging.
Yeah, and a lot of mainframes, to be quite frank. Legacy systems, applications that were hard to integrate with.
Yeah, that was my background. When I was first getting involved in IAM was with Walgreens way back when, and there were 4 of us who were responsible for creating mainframe accounts, Lotus Notes email accounts, which is a total nightmare to try and do anything with when it comes to IAM, as I found out later on in my career. But yeah, it was very account based, and we hadn't even considered really the concept of roles at that point. And this would have been early 2000s as we're going through that process. But it's funny, we didn't really even consider an IAM tool at that point, even though we were a fairly centralized team. There were still only 4 of us, for this entire pharmacy chain, essentially handling all the corporate and enterprise stuff. It took a few years as we started to really skyrocket from a access need perspective within the organization to recognize the need that, okay, we really need to start to figure out how we're going to scale, because SLAs become a concern. And this is back in the old days where it's Friday and we're all working out of one mailbox and there's literally nothing to do, right? So we're fighting over tickets to see who's going to grab it, who's going to grab the email, because there's something to do, because otherwise you're really kind of just sitting there. Because the demand wasn't there. Flash forward a decade, and you've got thousands of tickets in a queue, and you're managing a group of people. But it really was kind of a very simple time from an IAM perspective.
And this conversation to me is really reassuring, right? Because we really didn't know what we were doing. We had a vision, and we thought we knew where we were going, and together we tried to solve problems. But what that time became was a graveyard of failed implementations and unfulfilled promises and extremely disappointed customers. And, and a lot of hardworking salespeople, a lot of hardworking consultants, they're trying to figure this thing out. That was the vision, and it just wasn't working. And, a couple reasons for that, you do your role engineering exercise. It took forever. You tried to do implementations where it was, big bang. You tried to do everything at once. There wasn't this concept of, delayed perfection, but what is it that Chad says all the time? Incremental progress, which we really think about today. So there's a lot of failed implementations, a lot of money spent, and to this day we still see some remnants of that. I mean, there's some large organizations that are still suffering with a large investment sunk into an identity program that's connected to Active Directory. And that's it after, 5 years, 10 years. So that was a tough time for all of us, I think.
Why do you think, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, because I've been involved with, implementations that have started off great, having been on the customer side. And then they die out, and I know why those died out. Or at least I have a very good, reason why. I'm curious from your perspective, where do you see the failure when it comes time to kind of figure out post-mortem? Why is only Active Directory integrated with our IAM system after 2 years, 3 years, whatever it may be?
I think that goes back to what the work you guys do. I always tell clients that if you enter the partnership with us in advisory, our chances of success are much higher. And I think that is because we create executive support. And more important, so when you say, executive support, that's kind of like a buzzword. What does that really mean? What that really means to me is making them understand how difficult this thing is going to be. And making them understand that we're going to need the cooperation of the application owners, of HR. We're going to need the cooperation across the enterprise. And I think what happens in our projects, they used to, if you don't manage them correctly, they'll happen now, is people get tired.
Yeah.
Right. The project team gets tired. They get tired of fighting the political battle. and Active Directory usually goes first. Right?
It's supposed to be one of the easier ones, right?
And the AD team is one team. You go and you bang one team on the head. But, you think about people that are trying to onboard and bring into the identity program hundreds or thousands of applications. Man, that's a lot of difficult conversations for one team to be having.
Yeah. I think that executive support one is the important one because in my mind, that's money. I think when I think about where I was, a decade ago and really kind of starting to roll out IAM systems, for the corporations that I've worked for, it seems like they were really only funded for a point in time, right? The next 2 to 3 years. There wasn't really much planning beyond that, and that's just something that you kind of have to think about is this is a program, not a project.
Yeah. I remember having a conversation with a guy, he was like a director level professional, super go-getter. He wanted to fix things, and he called me, and I was really just giving advice because he didn't want to buy services. He didn't want to buy product. He'd been given by Microsoft, I think at the time was MIM or FIM. And he's like, I'm going to do this. And I said, look, man, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I promise you. But I'll tell you that if you embark on this journey by yourself, you are entering what I like to call a career cul-de-sac. Because you're not going to be able to do anything, and people are going to have expectations because they're like, you've got the licenses for free. Why isn't this thing done? Mm-hmm. And you just aren't going to be able to do it on yourself. And I think that really resonated for him. Free
enterprise software is not free. That's what I found. We see that a lot of times with, as I've seen it personally with, Oracle license are free from an IAM perspective because they get databases or something like that. But there's a lot of implementation that goes along with it. And there is that expectation of, it's free. Why didn't we have it up and running already? There's a way more to it. And that really applies to any software.
That's right. So back in the day, it was super hard. We were trying to solve a super difficult problem. We didn't really understand exactly where we were doing. This whole coordination in the enterprise was difficult. And we entered into what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment, to the point that it wasn't just one meeting. It was several meetings that I went into that my sponsor said, don't mention identity. Don't call this an identity project. And I was like, what do you want to call it, man? That was an interesting point in time. And then I remember being at an event, and my good friend, I'll mention him again, Mark Potter, pointed to a booth, and he said, oh, that's Avexa. That's hot stuff. And next to Avexa was SailPoint. And I'd never heard of Avexa and SailPoint. I had been competing with IBM and Oracle. And I kind of ignored it. I was never really a visionary. I was really, I sold the cars that were on the lot and did what I had to do. But lo and behold, those names were going to become very close to me. It's who I really started competing with. And I think they played a major role in changing the story around identity. So I'll keep going. I paused there for you guys to interject, but I'll keep going. So,
well, I was trying to think of a way to disagree with you, but no, you're right.
Yeah. There were two of them. So,
yeah.
And at that same time, which was really interesting, there was something happened called Sarbanes-Oxley. It was just about at that same time as well. And this isn't my quote. I was at a conference and I heard somebody say this, it must have been 12 years ago or so, that the best identity sales guys were Sarbanes and Oxley, right? They really got our space moving.
Oh yeah.
And it was at the time where Avexa and SailPoint entered, and pretty much what Avexa and SailPoint did was they said, you know what, this stuff right here that IBM, Oracle, and CA are trying to do, that's really hard. And that's not really where the value is. We're not looking to make IT people's jobs easier. We need to keep the CFO out of jail, and we need to allow accountability for access to be moved from IT down into the business. And that's when the value proposition shifted from IT optimization to governance, right? And the sequel to governance, or the symptom of governance, is security, right?
Yeah, SOX was a huge driver from my background. I mean, it essentially doubled my team just trying to manage SOX compliance, right? It's,
Yeah,
it's in its basic form, it's very simple, right? Just make sure that the access is approved and that you keep a record of that. You
exactly.
keep all your records in email and, and older ticketing systems that really weren't easy to search for, or like a generic ticket. It was super hard to try and demonstrate that to auditors that would come sit down at my desk and say, okay, here's these 30 people. They've all been terminated. Prove to me that they've been terminated. How do you prove a negative, right? The account doesn't exist.
That's right.
So you're having to look back through, sometimes paper, at that point. And
Yeah.
it was just a total pain in the ass.
And
Well, I think one of the things that I remember from that period that Luis was talking about was that those companies, I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but we still use it today. They talked about who has access to what. You need to be able to show who has access to what, and that's what their solution specialized in. And that just resonated with everybody. Like, how could you argue with that?
well,
I need to know who has access to what.
not only does that resonate from the standpoint of like, yeah, that makes sense, everybody needs to know, but remember, now we're no longer trying to do the really difficult things. So it's like every identity guy just ran over to that and said, yeah, let's do this. Because Jim, even in our projects today, the aggregation of identities, right? The consolidation of the identities into the identity system, and then correlation and doing the unique ID and cleaning the system. I'm not a practitioner, but from what I've seen, that's much easier than trying to automatically provision with entitlements and permissions, right? So everybody kind of flocked to that, I think.
Not everybody though. That was just the one thing that I wanted to interject was we spent the previous 5 years or 10 years training up the ladder that we need to automatically provision because there's no other way. I mean, that's what we can do. That's how we can solve this problem. So there was a mindset shift, at least where I was in my career, that was happening kind of grassroots of managing identities, that I started to get it, and I had to, move that information up because I was working for somebody who said, well, yeah, SailPoint and Avexa are great, but I need to, from an efficiency standpoint, I still need to do automated provisioning for thousands of applications. And I think, my feeling, and I feel like I'm going to say what you're going to say next, was that I think SailPoint and Avexa heard that, and they started to bolt onto their solution the ability to manage identities, right? At the same time, the big legacy vendors, the CA, Oracle, IBM, saw, hey, SailPoint and Avexa are stealing our lunch. We need to start doing governance. So you see, for example, I was in a CA shop around that time or a little bit later, and they had a governance minder product. CA bought a company. I don't remember which one. You probably do.
Yeah, EurekaFi.
EurekaFi, right? And then they said, we have governance minder. So, but that was a bolt-on. And I think the advantage was it's easier to bolt on administration and provisioning, or maybe not easier, but more sensical than to bolt on governance, where you've been pushing out, now you have to pull in, versus you're pulling in, now you have to push out.
That's a really interesting point, Jim, because it's really like kind of the legacy products, how they've evolved over time, right? It's like all these acquisitions, the new drivers would arise. And I remember that happening with role engineering, Sun bought Vayu. I think EurekaFi might have been, I think EurekaFi was actually the role engineering piece that CA bought. There was another one, it was an Israeli company, IAM Logic, that was kind of the governance piece as well. And these things became really hard to manage because it was just bolted on. And, even to this day, I don't want to criticize too harshly, but IBM has a problem where, their product, their legacy product, the two aspects of it don't work through the same interface as far as I understand. And we're still living that in the legacy world. And now if you think about it, it's funny how in the software world, things repeat themselves, this issue with maturity of the products becoming legacy vendors, and we see it going on over and over. One thing I wanted to mention before we keep walking down this line here, the hype cycle, is that, Jeff, something you said where your team doubled. right? When SOCs happen.
Yep.
To me, that's a direct indication of executive support, right? So not only did the problem get easier to fix, the products improved. We're on the second generation of products, and now CFOs cared because they wanted to stay out of jail.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's a big help, right?
Yeah, keep the auditors off their back, and they were happy. And I think every organization approached it a little bit differently. The most of the experience that I have, we decided to create centralized kind of IAM centers of excellence, right?
Yeah.
So things that were being disparately provisioned all around the enterprise, we pulled into one central group, common set of processes, a way of doing things, and then we had a strike team. Leslie and Ray, if you guys are listening, they went out and they were brought in specifically to help pull in SOX applications or applications that were identified as having SOX relevance into our group, and then just working through that. So there were, I want to say, at least several dozen that kind of fell into that when you consider mainframes, iSeries, kind of all that stuff. But there was definitely support to staff it. What I didn't really see as much support, though, was on the software side until it became a scaling problem where, we're going to have to double, triple, quadruple the size of the team just to keep pace with the volume of requests as the business continued to grow. Because when I first started, we were on store 4,000 at Walgreens. When I left, I think we were like 8,000. So we doubled just the store count alone. If you imagine, that's hundreds of thousands of users. Trying to manage all that, we definitely had to make an investment from the technology side just to keep pace.
Yeah, and something Jim said, right? The provisioning requirements still remained, right? And people were still doing that. Yet I think these side projects around governance were going on. Even when people had CA, IBM, and Oracle, they were deploying SailPoint at Avexa in parallel to that. And we had two magic quadrants, right? We had the identity management. Nobody says identity management anymore, right? We had the identity management magic quadrant. We had the governance quadrant.
Yeah.
And then we started to suffer a lot of business disruption in this space, right? Avexa got acquired around this time, I think, by EMC, and then EMC got acquired by RSA. No, RSA, and then EMC, and then Dell. So things started getting shaken up in this space. Meanwhile, BMC was falling off. Remember, guy, BMC had a product here, and SailPoint, I guess, acquired the BMC customer base or licenses. I wasn't really close to SailPoint at that time, so I don't know exactly how that went down. I was competing with them, but the net is what Jim was talking about was, the products got integrated, and you had provisioning and governance in the same product. That became a requirement, and Gartner released the identity governance and administration quadrant, which is still what we're seeing today. And we were on our way, kind of moving up that height, back up to where we weren't a bad word, towards the plateau of productivity.
Another thing that's happening in the background in this time frame was major publicly announced data breaches. And so we're also seeing,
TJ Maxx and
TJ Maxx, Home Depot, things like that, Target. But you also, you'd have the smart executive 10, 15 years ago would say, well, you want me to invest $1 million in security? Show me how it's going to save me more than $1 million. How's that a good business investment? But the shock factor of saying, hey, what if you suffer a data breach that costs you $300 million in brand equity? That wasn't even a conversation back then. Now it's like people know that's a reality, right? I mean, it's all over the news. So that's happening in the background, I think, more because one of the other things that you see, Gartner does a really good job. I think all of the analyst firms do, but talking about how the investment in security is, increasing every year, and it's just it enabled the industry to grow. And one of the other, I keep taking these sidetracks, but I think it's important to point out is that the identity and access management industry is always being driven by startup companies. So we talked about CA and Oracle. Neither one of those companies really started their identity management system. I think, I was really more close to Oracle. They had some things. They went out and bought Oblix. Then they went out and bought Thor. So small companies that grew into big companies. And, and you still see that today, where this is an industry where you can start as a very small company, build, a killer technology, and then get bought out by a larger company and added to a suite. And then sometimes those companies go, take a SailPoint or an Okta, for example. They'll start as a startup and grow all the way and become a public company on their own.
Jim, this conversation is great because I'm remembering things that I hadn't thought about in a long time. So about this time, you're absolutely right. People would come to us and they'd say, all right, this sounds great. Can you guys do an ROI analysis? And I'm not kidding. We as sales guys, we would look at that guy and we would say, no, you're not ready to buy this. We really did not do them, and we ran away because this was a governance play. It's a security play. You just do this. You don't ask me for an ROI. So you took me back to the day there, man.
It's all these cold shivers and bad memories.
One of my stories is, the company I was working for eventually went out and we bought Oblix, which later became Oracle Access Manager. But we trying to convince an executive they should spend a lot of money on a technology called Oblix that they've never heard of before. You have to explain what it does and why it's a good investment and things like that. And again, data breaches weren't in the news all the time. So we went back to the Oblix sales rep, who, by the way, was Tom Neckel, who had been at Identitropy, who later up.
Oh, I know Tom. Yeah, I was here a little while with him.
He was here at Identitropy for a while. Mm-hmm. He was our sales guy, and I asked him the same kind of question. I think he gave me the same cross-eyed look. But ultimately, the way they would build an ROI was, well, how much do you guys pay for a password reset?
Oh, password reset. Now you're going to the you're digging deep in the album crate here, man.
Yeah, that's right.
Password reset. We used to love that because we'd be like, that is ROI. There was tons of, we justify the whole identity project with password reset.
That's how I got into it. I spent way too much time running reports, trying to figure out how many passes we were doing, and it was just that's exactly how ours started.
And that's funny too, because that is significant value to the business, right? Like that's an identity value proposition where the users are grateful. The only thing perhaps better is single sign-on. And if you remember back in this day, now I'm mixing Gartner quadrants, I'm mixing sectors, but everybody wanted to do what we called enterprise single sign-on, which was single sign-on inside the organization, which was a pain. It was not easy to do.
Yeah.
And then things shifted again, right? It became more about web single sign-on. And more things were Active Directory centric. It wasn't really single sign-on. It was simplified sign-on, where you just used the same password over and over, but you didn't just automatically have access without authenticating.
Yeah, you'd have like little listeners running on AD. They'd pick up a password change, right? And then push that out. So it really wasn't
synchronization.
Yeah, exactly. Spent a lot of time in Windows Genas, right? Trying to make sure those things were working right for the users.
So go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I know you guys don't want to have a 2-hour podcast. I know we could probably. How are we doing on time?
I think we had a couple minutes. I want to ask you a couple questions outside of this. And I want to ask you, the first one is, from a hype perspective, what's something that you see today that is either really overhyped or underhyped, in your opinion?
AI.
And is it over or under?
Over. I mean, so I think this is really interesting, right? This is actually, now let's get the plateau. So, so what happened, right? These things became easier. Applications have programming interfaces now that we can go in. The synchronization problem became simpler. Expectations are less. So I don't want you to provision entitlements. Not some do, but I'm okay with you creating the account. So it got easier. The environment got less. You have more access to build these integrations. And we hit this plateau where it's working. Like we can look at our clients and we can say it's going to work. We have, 30 active projects. You know, a couple people might not be 100% satisfied, but generally we're doing our jobs and we're coming in under budget, and there aren't all these issues. So now enter this new era right now, right, where everybody knows that the enemy is within, right? Everybody understands insider threat. Everybody understands the walls are gone. People are accessing our data from outside of our data centers. So the old paradigm of firewalls and keeping people out is gone. So what's left for us, right, is identity. You know, if everybody's coming in and out, at least I want to know who's coming in and out, where they're going, right? And then, you know, these concepts of deep learning and machine learning and AI and all of this stuff that can process data more quickly and look for behavior patterns. That's the big promise we're all living right now. And to me, that creates now getting us out of this plateau and starting a new hype cycle, right? A new hype towards behavior-based automatic provisioning and behavior-based authentication and authorization and all of these things that I'm sure you're seeing as well. Would you agree with that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think probably we're talking about things like adaptive authentication, right? Conditional logic, you know, those types of things, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if it's AI is because there really hasn't been a real good application yet in the IAM space. I think there is logic, right? And you're trying to detect behaviors. I think that's probably just one phase of it. But I look at more from the end user side, right? When am I going to go and say, hey, well, I don't want to trigger my things in here, but, you know, if I say Alexa or Google or Siri, when are they going to, that natural language kind of input going to be able to infer, you know, what I'm trying to do? And then how does it help me get access to what I need, you know, going forward?
You know, so I think what we're seeing in AI that's not necessarily overhyped is you could apply AI within the product to simplify tasks, right? Repetitive tasks no longer need to be manual. There are things inside the product that are made easier, let's say. But the real value spans the product, and it really spans outside the product. It creates new product categories, right? So we're seeing the opportunity for integration between behavior analytics and identity governance, where identity governance tells us who has access to what. And now we have to start caring about what people are doing with that access, right? Yep. So there's a whole new shift that involves identity, that surrounds identity, that's wrapped around AI and intelligence and machine learning, that is going to force us to reevaluate our organizations that say, okay, I had identity over here and I had SIEM and behavior analytics over there. These teams need to collapse, or at the very least, they need to start speaking with one another, which somewhat reminds us, remember when you said you got your strike team formed?
Yep.
I think this is happening again, and I think it has to happen.
Yeah, there's going to be obviously maturity in the space as well, right? So products need to find some way to, how do you either get more value out of that or explore new avenues and, you know, other ways to kind of get feet in the door to fix security things, right? Like blockchain, right? Everyone's been talking about blockchain. You know, for IAM, I'm still not quite sure where that's going to be really applicable. Yeah, in an enterprise situation. I understand the benefits, right? You've got your distributed ledger, et cetera, but how does it fit in an IAM space beyond just a management of an identity, you know, that's maybe more self-sovereign type of things?
Well, I think that's yours and Jim's job, right? That's what's so interesting, because we sit somewhere between the vendor and the client. Our interests are aligned with the client always. What the client expects for us is to push them or pull them or help them really evolve, right, and improve. So once you're doing that, you're no longer doing meat and potatoes. You're really encouraging people to progress. So in that sense, we're moving towards the vendor, yet we're looking at the vendor and looking back into the customer and saying, well, we've never seen that done before. Right. And I think that that's really our biggest value proposition from an advisory and consultative perspective. Execution's huge, right? Chad and Wolcott, who runs our services, his teams, and screwing it in. It's like the two people you gave a shot out to. That's the super hard work. But I think our job is also extremely valuable to say, yeah, you know what? I don't really buy that. I don't really know if that's going to work, but we can try it and we can mitigate risk and we can do it in a pilot. But we're not just going to sell you that hook, line, and sinker.
Right. All right. I think we should probably start to close it out here. Jim, do you have anything that you want to add?
Just a thought that I was having as you guys were talking about that. It seems to me that one of the areas where, Luis identified the AI piece as overhyped. I think it might be overhyped from the standpoint of whether or not it actually gets a foothold. But in terms of the promise of what it could deliver, I think that's the biggest threat to organizations is that they won't even know when they're breached. But the data is there. All these systems are being logged. It's just you need the technology to piece it all together and put it on a dashboard to somebody to say, hey, something fishy is happening over here, or to trigger some automated actions to disable accounts, things like that, potentially either identifying or preventing data breaches before they occur. So I feel like the promise of where, hey, that the identification of this is the potential solution to the main problem that we have, I don't think that's overhyped. But whether or not the technology of user behavior analytics really ever gets there, the thing that I've found that I think holds back technologies from really succeeding is any kind of lack of standards. So if the smart people or the big leaders within the industry come together and form a group to set a standard like the SAML standard or the XML standard, and people really adopt it. And there are a lot of examples of those standards that haven't been nearly as successful as the ones I just mentioned. However, I feel like that could potentially help drive things. Products built around those standards, then companies have an easier time adopting them.
Yeah, so I agree. I think the technology's there, right? And it goes back to the same problem we saw with identity is that, we work a lot with Exabeam. They're great friends of ours. We picked them to integrate with SailPoint because they have phenomenal product, phenomenal team. But the experience in the end user is, what are the use cases, right? What are the data sources we're going to bring in? And in the intersection of Exabeam and SailPoint, what are the use cases? How can we leverage this extremely powerful tool? So I think it's organizational, and the vendors push and lead the way. But, I challenge our friends out there that are doing the hard work in the IT teams, in the security teams, the practitioners to really consider, and they don't have time to do it, but to consider how can we cooperate with these other people? And how can we get our processes together? How can we make these different tools all a part of our program? And I know we're wrapping up, but I'll just say, along those lines, an example of that is pretty much everybody owns MFA, right? Everybody owns a PAM tool. Everybody to some degree kind of has an IGA tool, be it, an AD tool like Active Role Server or Oracle Identity Manager. The challenge is how are we going to integrate those into our processes, and how do we tie all those things together? And I know that's what you guys struggle with, and that's why I'll end my piece here where I started it, which I always have a great deal of respect for you guys that are customer facing in the account, challenging and helping people move forward. I think my job's a lot easier.
I agree. And going back to Jim's point, and we'll close out here in a second. Yeah. There's so much data out there that's just not being used, and I think AI definitely can help with that, or at least the behavior analysis parts of it. There's an old saying, and I have no idea where I heard it or when, but there's two types of companies. There's ones that have been hacked, and the other ones that don't know it yet. Right? It's just the way it works. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Luis, totally appreciate your time. Being able to have a conversation like this is great. I hope you come back. And
thanks, Luis.
Hey, guys, it's a privilege. Just for the record, it is Friday at 4 p.m. And, us sales guys, about this time of day on a Friday, we start, wondering what we're doing here in front of the laptop. But to me, this was great. And thank you guys for having me. And, have a great weekend.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. To access all episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.